I am Daniel Guerrero, a current FY1 at Birmingham City Hospital, and this is my podcast on visual field defects. By the end of this podcast, viewers should develop a thorough understanding of the anatomy of the central visual pathway, and they should be able to confidently apply this knowledge for the localization of a lesion based on a given presenting visual field defect. I aim to achieve this by firstly reviewing the normal anatomy of the central visual pathway, and then by working through the anatomical disruption responsible for some common patterns of visual field defect. The process leading to visual perception begins with light entering the eye to form an image on the retina. The retina is located on the internal posterior surface of the globe. It is important to recognize that the image formed on the retina is both laterally and vertically inverted. This implies that the superior aspect of an object is imaged on the inferior aspect of the retina as shown in the illustration on the left. The illustration on the right demonstrates lateral inversion. The red arrowhead in the left visual field forms images on the right hemiretinae of both eyes. This has special clinical significance when trying to deduce the location of a lesion. Light passes through several structures on its way to the retina. These include the conjunctiva, cornea, aqueous humor, the pupil, the lens, and the vitreous humor as shown in the illustration. The following slide is a magnified view of the area denoted by the blue box. This slide depicts a schematic drawing of the microstructure of the retina. Light must pass through all the superficial neural structures on the left to reach the photoreceptors. The rod and cone photoreceptors transduce light energy into electrical signals which are passed to the bipolar cell via chemical messengers. The bipolar cell is located entirely within the retina and functions as the first-order neuron of the visual pathway. The bipolar cell subsequently passes the signal to the second-order sensory neuron, the ganglion cell. Ganglion cell axons travel in the most superficial layer of the retina towards the optic disc. This illustration shows the entire retina, including the macula lutea and fovea centralis, which are specialized for high visual acuity in the central visual field. All ganglion cell axons of the retina travel towards the optic disc where they group together to leave the posterior aspect of the eye as the optic nerve. This illustration of the base of the brain nicely demonstrates several aspects of the visual pathway. Both optic nerves can be seen extended towards the midline to converge at the optic chiasm. At this point, fibers from both nasal hemiretinae cross the midline to enter the contralateral optic tracts. This is known as the nasal hemidecussation. Fibers in the optic tracts travel towards the thalamus and synapse on third-order sensory neurons in the lateral geniculate nuclei. The axons of these neurons leave the lateral geniculate body to form optic radiations, which pass through the internal capsule to synapse in the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe. I have included a lateral view of the visual pathway to further clarify understanding of the anatomy. Once again, light enters the eye and forms an image on the retina. Next, light energy is transduced by the retinal photoreceptors into an electrical signal. This signal is propagated centrally via ganglion cell axons, which group together at the optic disc to leave the posterior aspect of the globe as the optic nerve. The optic nerve then enters the cranial vault via the optic canal. Subsequently, both optic nerves meet in the midline to form the optic chiasm where nasal hemidecussation occurs. The fibers travel through the optic tract to the lateral geniculate nuclei of the thalamus where they synapse. Cell bodies in the lateral geniculate nuclei then project axons towards the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe via superior and inferior optic radiations. Superior optic radiations extend into the parietal lobe and eventually synapse on the gyrus superior to the calcarine sulcus. Inferior optic radiations extend into the temporal lobe and eventually synapse on the gyrus just inferior to the calcarine sulcus. The calcarine sulcus is found on the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere in the occipital lobe as shown in this second image. This last illustration marks the end of the anatomy section. It brings together all the previously discussed anatomy to finally demonstrate the location of the entire visual pathway relative to the head. The rest of this podcast will use a schematic animation to illustrate the anatomical basis for common patterns of visual field defect. At the top of the screen, there is a grey rectangle which represents the prevailing environmental light exposure. It is split into right and left superior and inferior fields. Next are the two upper circles which represent the globes of the eye. Extending from the bottom of these are the optic nerve, which meet at the optic chiasm and then diverge to form the optic tracts. The two small circles just beneath the optic tracts represent the lateral geniculate nuclei, and extended from it are the optic radiations which terminate in the four sections of the primary visual cortex. Finally, there are two gray circles at the bottom of the screen which represent the perceived visual fields of each eye independently. The following animation demonstrates how the visual pathway operates in normality. Light is incident on the eye, and action potentials are propagated along the visual pathway to the primary visual cortex. As you can see, the signal is propagated through all the pathways previously discussed, and there is no visual field defect. This animation represents function of the visual pathway when there is a lesion in one of the optic nerves. As you can see, action potentials from the right eye are disrupted at the lesion and do not make it to the primary visual cortex. Therefore, there is no perception of light from that eye while the other eye functions normally. This is referred to as right monocular blindness. Of course, if the lesion was in the left optic nerve, then the patient would present with left monocular blindness. This animation represents function of the visual pathway in the case of a lesion at the optic chiasm. This usually occurs secondary to neoplasm within the pituitary gland, which is located immediately caudal to this structure. Signal propagation from fibers innervating both nasal hemiretinae are disrupted, as shown. No sensory information from the temporal fields of both eyes are propagated successfully to the primary visual cortex. Therefore, there is a temporal visual field defect in both eyes. This is referred to as bitemporal hemianopia. Hemianopia indicates a defect in half of the visual field, and bitemporal indicates that both temporal fields are affected. This animation represents the function of the visual pathway when there is a lesion in the optic tract. As shown, no sensory information is propagated to the ipsilateral primary visual cortex, and therefore there is no perception of light in the contralateral field of both eyes. This is referred to as a homonymous hemianopia. In this particular illustration, the lesion is on the right side, resulting in a left homonymous hemianopia. Once again, hemianopia indicates a visual defect in half of the visual field, and homonymous indicates that the same portion of the visual field is affected in both eyes. This final illustration shows function in the visual pathway with the presence of a lesion within an optic radiation. The lesion is located in the right inferior optic radiation and results in the disruption of all sensory signals to the right inferior gyrus of the primary visual cortex, as illustrated. This gyrus is responsible for the perception of light in the left upper quarter of the visual field, and therefore no light stimulus from this region is perceived in this case. This is referred to as a left homonymous superior quadrantenopia. Quadrantenopia indicates a defect in a quarter of the visual field, while homonymous is used once again to indicate that the same portion of the visual field is affected in both eyes. Left and superior are used to identify which one of the four quadrants is affected in this case. It should be noted that optic radiations carry sensory information from the contralateral and vertically opposite visual field. The visual pathway extends from the photoreceptors in the retina to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. Bipolar ganglion and thalamocortical cells are connected in series to bridge these structures. Lesions at or anterior to the optic nerve result in ipsilateral monocular visual field defects, while lesions at the optic chiasm result in bitemporal hemianopia. Lesions within the optic tract result in contralateral homonymous hemianopia, while lesions in the optic radiations result in contralateral and vertically inverted quadrantenopias. These are my references. Thank you very much for listening.